Do you remember the first Gainax anime you ever watched? This isn't a question that everyone can answer, but if you love anime, there's a good chance that you can. After all, Gainax is responsible for some of the most successful and popular anime of all time. The studio's blood runs through the veins of modern-day anime, even helping to influence some of the biggest series in the industry today, like Jujutsu Kaisen, for example. Truly, their reach knows no bounds. It's hard to imagine a modern-day anime industry without Gainax's influence. When it comes to the anime fandom, they are the end-all, be-all. Wait, hold on, what does this say right here? It says here that Gainax is filed for bankruptcy. Wait, what? Yeah, so if you haven't heard by now, as of last week, Gainax has officially declared bankruptcy. And I hadn't been keeping up with the studio closely in recent years, so when I heard this, I understandably was in shock. I mean, how can Gainax, one of the most legendary studios in all of Japan, just be gone? They've created so many popular shows. They've built up such a reputation. Gainax is untouchable. This is what I thought. Then I started doing some reading. And once you do some digging, you find out that Gainax's bankruptcy isn't unprecedented. In fact, it's far from it. The downfall of Gainax is a tale of both mismanagement as well as disturbing controversy. However, to fully understand the fall of Gainax, we must first understand the rise of Gainax and how it garnered its reputation as one of the most unforgettable anime studios to ever exist. It was the early 80s, and at this point, anime had completely taken over Japan. Everywhere you looked, new and popular anime series were popping up everywhere, and naturally, an entire culture would form around this. Most of you have probably heard the word otaku before, basically a Japanese term for someone who is a big fan of something, typically anime, manga, or video games. From what I've seen, there's no common agreement on how the specific word otaku came to be synonymous with this type of person, but that's a video for another day. All you need to know is that otaku culture was the breeding ground from which Gainax would be born. If you've seen our video on Studio Mappa, it should come as no surprise that when you are an already well-established veteran in the anime industry, it is much easier to form your own studio. You have clout and well-established fans and partners who are more than likely going to invest in your studio and products. Gainax did not have any of this. In fact, the people who formed Gainax were, for the most part, nerds. The majority of Gainax's founders were actually in university when the animation studio was created. And I really need to put the word studio in quotations here because calling Gainax a professional animation studio during this time would be generous to say the least. I mean, they weren't even called Gainax at this point. Rather, they were known as Daikon Film. Essentially a group of amateur animators, artists, and otaku that was created for the sole purpose of making animated shorts for the Nihon SF Takai convention. These shorts, known as Daikon 3 and 4, would be shown at the convention's opening ceremonies. And while the first short, Daikon 3, is impressive in its own right, what really caught everyone's attention was Daikon 4. This 7-minute short is teeming with what is honestly still some of the coolest animation I've ever seen. The fact that something like this was made by students on a shoestring budget is honestly insane. And that's not even counting the fact that you basically have every pop culture icon from the time that you can imagine packed in here. Daikon 4, despite essentially being just a silly short for a fan convention, has gone on to become a legendary piece of animation in otaku culture. So despite the fact that Daikon Film was not a huge operation, their passion for animation was evident. And because of this, they were able to slowly grow and grow as a studio. From here, they would change their name to Gainax and begin work on professional projects, including films like Royal Space Force, OVAs like Gunbuster, and full-on TV shows like Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water. These projects, however, while not massive disasters, didn't really launch the studio into massive success. While they had a foothold in the late 80s and early 90s, it didn't really feel like they were advancing much within the industry. This would all change with the birth of Evangelion. Neon Genesis Evangelion premiered on October 4th, 1995, and would go on to define Gainax as we know it. It is well known at this point that Evangelion was created by Hideaki Anno, one of Gainax's many co-founders, and really just one of the most influential Japanese animators and filmmakers of all time, period. Anno had always been drawn to animation in his early life, and naturally developed quite the skill for it, even as an amateur animator. By the time Gainax had been founded, Anno had been given the opportunity to work on many projects, including the iconic Miyazaki masterpiece Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, where he would animate one of the film's most impressive sequences, the reawakening of the god warrior. And it's here that you can really just see Anno's full talent on display. Along with an incredible skill in animation, Anno has always had an affinity for mecha and machinery. In fact, the first position he ever held in his professional career was as an animator for the now well-known Super Dimension Fortress Macross series, or better known in the States as Robotech. Mecha and tokusatsu is something that is fused within Anno's very soul, so naturally, when given the opportunity to make something that is his very own, he would put as much of himself into the series as possible. I tried to include everything of myself in Neon Genesis Evangelion. Myself, a broken man who could do nothing for 4 years. A man who ran away for 4 years, one who was simply not dead. Then one thought, you can't run away, came to me, and I restarted this production. It was a production where my only thought was to burn my feelings into film. Neon Genesis Evangelion was unlike anything anyone had seen up to that point. While yes, it was a mecha anime, the designs of the mechs themselves were strange and unprecedented. They were slim, lanky, and not even really robots, but living creatures that honestly made them more akin to something like kaiju than mechs. Along with this, Evangelion was much more cerebral and introspective than any other mecha anime at the time, delving deep into the psyche of its characters. And despite a rather controversial and quite frankly somewhat confusing ending, which would then be rectified by a theatrical movie which went from confusing to what the? Evangelion would become a ludicrous success, cementing itself as one of the most iconic and unforgettable anime series ever created. And with this success, Gainax would go on to create even more classics like Fully Cooley, Gurren Lagann, and Panty and Stocking. No longer were they that up-and-coming studio created by otaku struggling to stay afloat. They were now Gainax, one of the most prestigious and well-known studios within Japan, essentially untouchable. Until they weren't. The culprit for the downfall of Gainax would ultimately prove to be its incredibly shoddy management, particularly with the way it handled money and debt. In 2006, Hideaki Anno would create Studio Kara, and would bring much of Gainax's talent along with him. By 2007, with Studio Kara's first project, Evangelion 1.0 You Are Not Alone, Anno would officially resign from Gainax. At this point, Gainax still held the copyright for Evangelion, though some kind of deal was put into place that allowed Anno to release his new Eva movies with Studio Kara, as well as receive royalty checks from Gainax for Evangelion. The issue is that eventually these checks just stopped coming, and what's worse is that Gainax had also asked Studio Kara for a 100 million yen loan in 2014, which they just also didn't Pay? Apparently, this has been an issue with Gainax for a while. The company getting involved in frivolous endeavors like restaurant chains and computer graphics operations, not really seeing any profit from it, and slowly drowning in its finances. This would all come to a head in 2016 when Studio Kara would sue Gainax for 100 million yen in unpaid royalties, which by 2017, they were ordered to pay in full by a Tokyo District Court judge. After this occurred, co-founder and then president of Gainax, Hiroyuki Yamaga, would post a public apology stating that the company was going to be restructured in a fashion that would hopefully help them maintain their business in the future. And well, things only got worse from there. In 2019, Tomohiro Maki, Gainax's then president, was arrested for indecent acts on an aspiring voice actress, who at this point is understandably still unnamed. Maki would then go on to be sentenced to over 2 years in prison, and this was basically the nail in the coffin for Gainax. All of its talent had packed up and went on to work on much more promising endeavors. It had racked up a massive debt that didn't allow it to enter production committees, which in this day and age is the primary way in which anime is made. And I mean, at this point, it wasn't even called Gainax anymore. The name had changed to Gaina after it had been bought by Kinoshita. Gainax was a shell of its former self, and inevitably, this is what led to its death. On May 29th, 2024, Gainax would file for bankruptcy, the studio now officially defunct. The studio's trademark, as well as all of its franchises, would be transferred to Kara, who will now oversee how these franchises will be distributed to different owners. So while Gainax is dead, at the very least, the series that many fans have come to love won't be. And really, that's the thing that matters the most. Right? I think that the biggest thing we can learn from this whole situation with Gainax is that people put way too much stock into names and brands. Yeah, Gainax was a legendary studio, but it's not legendary because of its name. It's legendary because of the creators who worked there and made all of these things possible. And really, this goes for just about any animation studio. Over the years, these entities can change drastically to the point that people who work there are completely different from the people who made that thing you really liked years ago. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but I think it is something that a lot of studios don't want people to really think about. In fact, the only studio that I've ever really seen address this topic head on is Studio Ghibli, with Miyazaki and many of the leaders at Ghibli insisting that they don't really see a future for the studio without Miyazaki there. And yeah, it's sad to see these big iconic names in the industry that gave us so many great things disappear, but are they really disappearing? Gainax is dead, but it really isn't. Its most influential creators still live on and are creating really great things to this day. So for what it's worth, the entity Gainax is gone, but its spirit will always live on. Not as a name, but as the people who brought it to life in the first place.